Good morning. So yeah, I'm going to talk about my view of the state of the market, just to manage expectations. I'm not going to, as you can see from my job title, I'm not going to dive into numbers and growth rates and installed bases. As a matter of fact, Patrick in his previous talk already mentioned a few numbers on the installed base of VR units. I'm going to specifically talk about my personal view of the state of the market, and specifically about another topic related to that, and the fact that so many people are currently obviously being very enthusiastic about VR, but at the same time there's also quite a few naysayers out there now that we've got the first proper year of VR behind us. And you know, I watched Patrick's talk just now, and he was very excited about all things that I'm equally excited about. But the question, of course, is what about all these other people who are saying that VR is dead on arrival, or that the numbers are disappointing, etc., etc. And the more important question to that is, why would you believe us if we say that everything's going to be fine? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the argument revolving around why VR is dead, or why VR has a lot of potential still. And if you listen to conversations between people when they're talking about the notion of the potential of VR, it usually revolves around three different topics. It's either price. The naysayers are saying that the VR headsets are too expensive. And then obviously the people who are positive and optimistic about VR are saying that it's too expensive. And that's why it's currently not still doing what it's supposed to be doing, but when prices will come down, everything will be fine. And then the second argument is usually revolving around content, with people saying, the naysayers saying there's not enough killer apps out there. And then again, people are optimistic about VR, saying, well, the reason why it's still slow in terms of the traction it's gaining is because there's not enough killer apps out there, which is kind of like same argument. And then finally, of course, and this was also mentioned before, the notion of the experience is also important. The fact that you have to have a pretty powerful PC, you're tethered to a PC, or the alternative is that you have a non-positional tracking VR headset, which I think is not really true in proper VR anyway, is what's holding VR back at the moment. And depending on who you talk to and when you talk to people, you'll get different outcomes of these different three arguments revolving around the potential of VR. Let's just run through some stakeholders of the people who have been in the VR business over the past 3 years. If you talk to analysts and you talk to them in 2015, they're extremely optimistic about VR, to the point that it's insane. We've seen some reports where even we, pitching to our investors, knew that some of these reports were just outright bullshit, if you pardon my French, but some of those reports just are full of errors and do not represent the true state of VR. Even in 2015, there was talk in one of the Goldman Sachs reports of an Xbox VR device in 2015 already, which simply does not exist, doesn't even exist to this day. And the interesting thing is that in 2017, over the past year, you've seen lots of reports from the same analysts who are basically now saying that our predictions were this, and because they didn't meet those predictions, we declare VR a failure, which is kind of insane. First you predict, you over-predict, and then you say, because we didn't hit those predictions, that VR isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing. The media, never offend the media, so I'm going to be a little bit more pleasant here. So the media, again, very enthusiastic in 2015. I'm sure most of you remember this Wired cover where VR was destined to change everything, including sex, which is kind of interesting, because that never happened, or at least didn't happen up until now. And again, come 2017, this is exactly where you see some of the more negative reports coming from. The actual image I showed you on VR is dead, I think, is actually from a TechCrunch article declaring VR dead on arrival. Fortunately, there are still some positive journalists out there, or I should say level-headed journalists who are honest about the pros and cons of where we are right now and the potential. Investors, same thing really as analysts. They all bought into the hype and the reports. And now you have some investors who are a little bit unhappy, which is kind of strange because most of the time investors are in it for 3 to 5 years and not expecting necessarily a return within the first year of launch. Because we have to keep in mind that PlayStation VR, which was the last of the 3 headsets, only launched just over a year ago. So we've only been really 1 year old. I could say that Gear VR launched even before that, but again, that's not true in proper VR. There are some investors who are still happy. We have some in our company, but it's been a challenge to keep them convinced that the potential is there and we're slowly getting there. And then finally, creators, developers who were extremely bullish in 2015. And now I'm hearing very negative sentiments left, right, and center. People even pulling out of the industry, saying, okay, there's no money to be made in VR from a consumer point of view, so I'm going to go back to mobile, or I'm reverting back to traditional PS4, Xbox, PC development, or non-VR agency assignments. And then there's people who are happy. And this is obviously, everything we're going to say today is very biased. Because we are a company with close to 70 people right now. We're based in Amsterdam, so of course I would be saying that VR has tremendous potential. We've been working in this space now for 3 years. We've already created 8 experiences, and by the end of Q1 2018 we'll have delivered 11 games and experience onto the market. We're profitable, have been so for the past 3 years, and we are increasing our revenue on a yearly basis. So of course I'm going to say that VR is great and VR is going to have potential and VR is going to deliver on all of its promises. So of course also I'm going to say, when Mark Zuckerberg goes on stage at OC4 last October, of course I'm going to say, yeah, he's right. At a certain point we will have 1 billion people in VR. And of course I'm going to say that because in that same talk he announced 2 new headsets, one of them which I think is extremely exciting, which is the Santa Cruz standalone headset. And of course I'm excited for that because we created the actual showcase demo for that, which was shown on stage by him at the event. We've been working with the hardware now for the past 6 months, and it's fantastic. And he also announced Oculus Go at the same event. It's kind of like an in-between step between where we currently are with Gear VR and where we're going with Santa Cruz. So of course I'm excited for where this is going with Santa Cruz. Also because we're working on next-gen VR, but we're also seeing some other stuff appearing on the horizon in terms of the properties we're developing. And as I said, at the end of Q1 2018, we will have delivered over 11 experiences in the VR marketplace, working for hardware manufacturers, but also working for other third-party publishers. And so far, we're happy. Very happy, as you can see. But in order to explain to you why we're happy and why we still believe in the potential, I need to go back to actually GDC 2004. Because you could also say we've been lucky and we all realize that this is not going to last forever, so let's pull out. That could also be an argument. But I firmly believe that this industry is going to fulfill its potential moving forward. And I base it on a simple story I actually encountered a few years ago when I was visiting GDC in 2004. This was one of the very first mobile game conferences. GDC 2004, there were Korean companies and US companies talking about how mobile would at a certain moment be serving 1 billion customers. Sounds familiar, sounds very much like Mr. Zuckerberg's talk on stage. And you have to remember that in 2004, mobile gaming, obviously, and most of you know this, looked like this. And this was actually one of the games you could actually play directly on your phone. For many of the other pieces of entertainment content that you wanted to play on your mobile phone, you had to actually put in some kind of WAP configuration, and then you had to go to some kind of provider portal, and then you could select a few games and download them, and they had to be compatible, and there was like 60 different compatible headsets, and you had to be lucky if you wanted to get something. So when people in these talks were talking to me about 1 billion customers, I was like, yeah, forget it. It's never going to happen. And a year later, I returned to GDC, and I knew some of these people actually working in the mobile games industry back then. And they were obviously still a little bit bullish, but also a little bit worried a year later. 2 years later, 2006, same situation. Some of them had actually lost faith, pulled out, just like some of the other developers that I've just mentioned pulled out of the VR industry. And they were clearly thinking that was never going to happen. And then in 2007, this guy turns up with the iPhone, and the rest, of course, is history. But the interesting thing about the iPhone is not that it should be compared to VR. It's going back to the same arguments we had about VR. The interesting thing about the iPhone is that it became the all-conquering device. But it had nothing to do with price. As a matter of fact, the first iPhone was more expensive than any of the feature phones out on the market. It also had nothing to do with killer apps or killer app content, because as you may remember, the first iPhone for the first, I think, 6 to 9 months did not have an app store. There was no way to get content for your iPhone. There was no killer app content. It was just a device. It all came down to that third argument, the experience. And we all remember, obviously, that classic video where Steve Jobs shows the device on stage, and he almost gently swipes it, and you see that scrolling list of music, songs, whatever. And everybody was like, I need to get one of these devices. And he pinches to zoom, and everybody was like, I need to get one of these devices. It was the experience that made the iPhone successful. So you're now obviously thinking, okay, I get this. So he's talking about how the new devices are going to be the second coming of VR, or the third coming if you also take the 80s into consideration. But that's not the case. I mean, I can't say for sure that Santa Cruz or any of these standalone headsets are going to be to current VR what the smartphone was to the original feature phone. What I will say is that Santa Cruz, now having worked with the device for well over half a year, is a game changer. There is a big, big difference in being able to pick up a device, put it on your head, no cables attached, and also having positional tracking the moment you turn on the device. Being able to walk around, scan everything around you, and being in another environment is just amazing. If it's amazing enough to be the tipping point, I think it is, but the point of this is that it's not just about the comparison with smartphone versus feature phone. It's all about the notion that if you fundamentally believe in an industry and in the functional mechanics of that industry, as long as you can see in the foreseeable future that technology is going to resolve some of the hurdles and obstacles and frictions, then I think you should be very, very careful to see it make a big jump in the foreseeable future. And the same, I think, applies to some of the other industries we know. I think if you look at Netflix, which started out literally as a mail order experience. I don't know how many of you have Netflix? There you go. So how many of you would be prepared to, for the same price, get the same content, and everything is delivered to you on your doorstep by mail, perhaps let's make it easy, on a daily basis. So it used to be on a weekly basis, now it's on a daily basis. Nobody, right? Because you now have to get up from your couch, you need to put the disc into your device, you have to get back. It's the same thing you're watching, it's the same episode of whatever series you're watching, but it's the friction of, the smallest friction that can sometimes mean the difference between mass market availability and small scale niche. And the same I think for Spotify. Nobody of you would probably want to go back to hooking up your iPhone to iTunes and downloading songs and putting them on there and then listening to them on the go if you have Spotify. It's a small step, but it's a major game changer. Still, do I believe in 1 billion people in virtual reality? Yes. When will that happen? Difficult to say. I can't say and I can't predict that it will happen overnight in a year's time because of the state of the technology that is supporting these devices that needs to be delivered in terms of costs, in terms of the pricing it's going to go out for, in terms of the competition. The competition needs to drive prices down because price is still going to be a major driver in the end, always. But I think there's another important thing that may prevent us from hitting that 1 billion people if we're not careful. The devices are there, the devices are going to improve, and that seamless experience is going to happen in a few years' time, if not in the coming year and a half. The big thing that I think is holding us back at the moment is the notion that we're seeing this, and we have seen this over the past 2 or 3 years, especially with all those analyst predictions, and that's also what you saw with the Wired cover where VR was supposedly going to change everything. It's the constant notion that we feel that VR is going to be the next big computing platform. It's going to be the all-conquering, bigger than mobile, bigger than traditional screens, bigger than anything kind of notion, which I think is arrogant, but I also think it's wrong. Because VR isn't going to change everything. There's limitations. Certain genres do not fit in games. Certain genres do not fit with VR. Certain experiences do not work well with VR. They work better on mobile, just as some other experiences work better on consoles or PCs. Just as some other experiences work better just watched on a 2D screen rather than a VR screen or a 3D screen or whatever. So we should stop starting to treat ourselves as if we're kind of like the special kid in the room who's going to conquer everything. Another thing that I think is really, really important moving forward is that we start to include the human presence as quickly as possible in all of our VR experiences. I think we are done with notions of people going on stage saying the big thing about VR is presence and immersion. The moment you go into a virtual world and it's empty and it's lifeless, you start to understand how virtual it is. And in order for a virtual world to come alive, you want other people to be in there. So moving forward, all the games and experiences that we're creating at the moment at Force Field are all going to have a social co-presence component attached to them. There's no exception. This is basically now part of our mantra. Everything needs to be working with other players in there, and all the experiences need to be designed around it. And we're even going one step further. Based on the previous notion that we shouldn't treat ourselves as the center of the universe, we should also try and see how we can embrace other games out there, how we can embrace other experiences out there from different industries, whether it's mobile or console or PC, and how can we bring VR players and VR users together with non-VR players and non-VR users. We call it hybrid VR or hybrid experiences, whatever you want to call it. And again, it's a big part of all our experiences moving forward. So rather than having two separate ecosystems and organizing VR conferences around VR for the next 10 years, I'm actually advocating that we should bring ecosystems together and be part of a growing technology tree with some amazing hardware that's coming down the horizon. So with that, that's it. Thank you.
Right, got time for 1 or 2 questions. Straight up from Patrick.
So I saw a talk a while ago talking about when 5G came about that cloud rendering of VR would be possible. The latency would be so low that you could actually render VR in cloud. You talked about Netflix and you talked about Spotify. Do you think that maybe one of the things that's needed to get truly mass market is that you can just start a game instantly, it's rendered in the cloud, you don't need processing locally, it just kind of works rather than having to download and install?
Well, I definitely believe that that's a fantastic opportunity coming down the road. The only thing that's, I think, we're currently worrying, and it's for VR in general, is that we keep introducing new technologies and new things on the horizon. And obviously consumers are slowly getting into that, and they're basically saying, okay, if this is the next big thing, and there's another next big thing on the horizon, why don't I just wait until the next big thing arrives? So we have the risk that we're actually making hardware more expensive, because don't get me wrong, I do believe that price is important, but I don't know how pricey that is going to be compared to how pricey the hardware is going to be in a year or 2 years' time. But I definitely see that, for me, it's all about being seamless, putting something on and being immersed in a scene without anything that distracts from that, and that can definitely help. But I also want to make sure that we don't get too far ahead of us and start creating experiences for future technology, so to say.
Cool, we've got time for one more question, which is over to you. Maybe this sort of follows on, I'm not sure, but I think one of the common elements with, say, the smartphone versus the feature phones, Netflix and its move over to streaming and Spotify also streaming, the common element is the internet, and I think that's, in my opinion, the main common factor that's driven the growth of those things. Do you think that the internet will do the same thing for VR, or will there be some amazing thing that's...
Well, no, I think in line with Patrick's comment, I think, you know, if you look at the stuff that Improbable is doing, cloud-based worlds, the connection between players in all these different virtual worlds or virtual environments, that's effectively the backbone of the internet. So yes, I definitely believe that connectivity, as I'd rather call it, is key, and streaming can definitely help there.
Cool, lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to give another clap, everyone?